There was, for a long time, a kind of quiet certainty among sailors, and it was this: iron could not cross an ocean. Wood could cross an ocean. Wood had carried men and cargo and cannon across every sea on the globe for as long as anyone could remember. And wood, everyone agreed, was what a ship was made of, in the same unquestioned way that a house was made of stone or a coat was made of wool. Iron sank. Iron was heavy and cold and belonged to anchors and chains and the small fittings that held a wooden hull together, not to the hull itself. And so, when word first spread along the quays of Bristol in the 1830s that a new ship was being built almost entirely of iron and that she was meant not for a river or a harbour, but for the open Atlantic, the response among men who had spent their lives at sea was not excitement. It was disbelief, quiet at first, then argued over in taverns and shipping offices. The kind of disbelief that comes from watching someone attempt to build a house of unfamiliar material and waiting, almost without malice, to see it fail. This is the story of that ship. She was called the Great Britain, and she would eventually prove nearly everyone wrong, though not before the world had watched her being built with something closer to suspicion than pride. She was laid down in a city that had built its wealth and its reputation on wooden ships, on oak frames and tarred rope, and the long, patient traditions of the shipwright's yard. And into that world she arrived as something almost unwelcome, an iron intrusion into a craft that had not changed in any fundamental way for centuries. It is worth sitting with that discomfort for a moment, because it is the quiet seed from which the entire story grows. Nothing about the Great Britain was inevitable. She was, in the truest sense, an argument made in metal, a wager placed by a handful of men against the settled wisdom of an entire industry. Consider the scale of what was being attempted, set down here in the plainest terms without ornament, because the facts alone carry enough weight. When she was completed, the Great Britain was longer than any ship afloat, longer than any warship in any navy, longer than any merchant vessel that had ever put to sea. She would not be pushed across the water by paddle wheels, the great turning wheels that drove nearly every steamship of her age, churning white water at the sides of the hull in a manner that had become, by then, almost synonymous with the very idea of a steam-powered vessel. Instead, she would be driven by a screw, a propeller turning beneath the water at her stern, unseen, ungainly to look at when lifted from the water, and almost entirely untested at this scale. Two unproven ideas then, joined together in a single hull, iron construction and screw propulsion, brought together not as a modest experiment in a small vessel, but as the foundation of the largest ship in the world. It was, by any reasonable measure of the time, an extraordinary risk. And she was built, of all places, in Bristol, a city whose harbour had made its name and its fortune on wooden ships, on the merchant trade that had carried sugar and tobacco, and in an earlier and darker century, human beings, across the Atlantic and back again in vessels shaped from English oak. Bristol knew wood. Bristol's shipwrights had learned their trade from fathers who had learned it from their own fathers, an inheritance of knowledge about grain and curve and the particular way a timber hull settles into the water. Into this city, this trade, this inherited certainty, came a ship that owed almost nothing to that tradition at all. It is not hard to imagine what the old shipwrights must have felt, walking past the dock where her frames were rising, plate by riveted plate, into a shape no one in that city had built before. Whether they scoffed or simply watched in silence, the sources do not always tell us, but the tension between the old craft and the new one hangs over the entire enterprise, present in every account that survives. The man behind her deserves to be named here as well, though his fuller story will unfold slowly in its own time, the way most things in this account will unfold. His name was Isambard Kingdom Brunel, and by the time the Great Britain was conceived, he was already known, though not yet in the way history would eventually remember him. He was an engineer of restless ambition, a man who seemed constitutionally unable to accept that the size or shape or material of a thing should be limited by what had come before it. He is spoken of, in the records that survive, with a mixture of admiration and exasperation by the men who worked alongside him. Admiration for the audacity of his thinking, and exasperation, no doubt, at the cost and difficulty of turning that thinking into riveted iron plate. He will appear again and again through this account, not as a distant genius, but as a man wrestling, quite literally, with the limits of what could be built, financed, and floated in his own lifetime. But it is worth pausing here, before the story of the yard and the funding and the long argument over iron versus wood, to simply sit with the central wonder of the thing, because it is a wonder that took more than a century to fully resolve. This was a hull built almost entirely of iron, at a moment when the very idea of an iron ocean-going ship was still treated by many as a kind of engineering fantasy, something that might work on paper or in a small trial vessel, but surely could not survive the true violence of the open Atlantic. And this hull, against every expectation placed upon it, would not simply survive one crossing or two. It would go on to outlive the century that built it. It would be abandoned and lost and left to rust and flood in a distant harbor for the better part of a lifetime, given up by nearly everyone who might have remembered her name. And then, decades later, she would be found again, hauled from the water in a condition that seemed, to the people who found her, almost impossible, and brought home to the very dock in Bristol where her iron plates had first been raised. That return across so many years and so much loss is the quiet promise sitting at the center of this whole account. She would sink beneath obscurity, though never quite beneath the water in the way anyone expected, and she would rise again. And if that alone does not seem remarkable, then perhaps it is worth remembering how few ships of her age can say the same. It is a strange kind of comfort, in a story about iron and ambition and the doubts of an entire industry, to know from the outset that the ship survives, in some form even now. There is no need here to build false suspense about her fate, because her fate is part of what makes her worth speaking of at all. What remains uncertain, what still deserves a slow and careful telling, is everything that happened between her beginning and her return. The arguments in the boardrooms of Bristol, the raising of a shape no one had built before, the terror and triumph of her first ocean crossing, the storms and the groundings and the long decades of hard, unglamorous service that followed, before her eventual abandonment and her long silence at the bottom of a cold and distant harbor. Before any of that, though, there is simply this: a city, a company, and a man convinced that iron could cross an ocean when almost no one else believed it. If you find some quiet comfort in ships like this one, in the long, patient history of human beings building things larger and stranger than anyone expected them to, you are welcome to stay a while longer here. And if you'd like more of these voyages when they arrive, there is a simple button for that, and then we'll leave it there and let the story carry itself. For now, the year is turning toward the 1830s, and in the port city of Bristol, a company of ambitious men is beginning to imagine a ship the likes of which the Atlantic has never carried, and the age that built her is only just beginning to take its final shape. To understand why such a ship could be imagined at all, one must first understand the city that imagined her. And Bristol, in the early years of the 19th century, was a place that had built its entire life upon the tide. For centuries, the River Avon had carried ships up from the sea in a long, winding channel, past red sandstone cliffs and green fields, into a harbor that lay, curiously, some 7 miles inland from open water. This was no accident of geography, but a fact the city had learned to live with, shaping its docks and its habits around a river that rose and fell more than 30 feet between low water and high, leaving vessels stranded on mud banks for hours if their captains misjudged the hour. Sailors who came to Bristol from other ports often remarked on the strangeness of it, the way ships settled into the mud like sleeping animals and waited, patient, for the water to return and lift them free. It was a city that understood waiting, understood the slow negotiations between wood and water and time, because it had practiced them for as long as anyone could remember. By the turn of the century, Bristol's fortune had been built on sail, on the deep holds of merchant ships that had once carried sugar and tobacco, and, in a history the city would spend generations trying to reckon with, human beings taken from the coasts of Africa in the long and terrible trade that had enriched its wharves and warehouses. That trade had ended by law in the first years of the 1800s, and Bristol's merchants had turned, as merchants do, toward whatever commerce remained profitable and respectable enough to sustain them. Wine from Portugal, cotton from the American South, timber from the Baltic, and always the steady traffic of passengers and goods moving between Britain and the wider world. The shipyards along the floating harbour, an artificial basin cut to keep vessels afloat regardless of the tide, still built their hulls from oak and elm in the old way, following methods that had changed only gradually across 300 or 400 years. A shipwright walking those yards in 1820 would have recognised much of what his grandfather had known. The curve of a keel laid down in timber, the slow steaming and bending of planks, the careful fitting of ribs by eye and by hand. It was skilled work, honoured work, but it was not new work, and Bristol, for all its pride, had begun to sense that the world around it was shifting in ways that oak and elm might not be able to follow. The uncertainty arrived, as it so often does, in the shape of smoke on the water. Steam engines had already proven themselves ashore, turning the wheels of mills and pumping water from mines, and by the 1810s and 20s a handful of engineers had begun fitting them into small vessels, mostly for river and coastal work, where the engines could push a paddle wheel against a current too strong for sail alone to manage reliably. These early steamers were viewed with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Sailors who had spent their lives reading wind and current found little use for a machine that clattered and smoked and required feeding with coal rather than trimming with rope, and many considered the whole business faintly undignified, a kind of mechanical shortcut that lacked the seamanship of true sailing. Merchants, for their part, were often more pragmatic, willing to consider anything that might move cargo faster and with fewer delays, but even they hesitated before committing serious capital to a technology whose reliability over long distances remained entirely unproven. A steam engine that broke down in the middle of the Atlantic, after all, would leave a ship no better off than a sailing vessel becalmed, and likely worse, since it would be carrying the added weight and expense of machinery that had failed to earn its place aboard. And yet the ambition to connect Britain and America by something faster and more dependable than sail alone had already taken hold of the age, regardless of these doubts. The Atlantic crossing, for all the centuries sailors had made it, remained a voyage governed entirely by wind and weather, a passage that might take 3 weeks on a fair run, or 6 weeks or more, if the winds turned against a ship and held her back day after frustrating day. Merchants who depended on regular schedules, bankers who needed news to arrive on predictable dates, and passengers who simply wished to know when they might see land again, all shared a growing appetite for something more reliable than the old uncertainty of sail. Steam, whatever its faults, offered a ship that did not depend entirely on the mood of the wind, an engine that could push forward against contrary currents and hold a course a captain chose rather than one the weather dictated. Across the 1820s, small steam packets had already begun working the Irish Sea and the routes along the English coast, proving the engines could be trusted over shorter distances, and a handful of visionaries had begun to whisper about a crossing of the ocean itself, though most engineers of the day considered a steamship far too heavy with coal to ever make it across without running out of fuel somewhere in the middle of that vast grey distance. Bristol watched all of this unfold with a particular kind of civic anxiety, because Bristol understood perhaps more clearly than any other English port that its position in the world was no longer secure. Liverpool, on the western coast, had spent decades expanding its docks and deepening its channels, drawing away trade with facilities that Bristol's tidal harbour, however cleverly managed, could not easily match. London, with the whole weight of empire and government behind it, needed no introduction to any merchant seeking connections or capital. Bristol, by contrast, was a city increasingly aware that its old advantages, the deep history, the established trading houses, the centuries of maritime experience, might not be enough to keep it relevant in an age that was beginning to reward speed, scale, and technological daring above tradition. There was a real fear, spoken in coffee houses and merchant exchanges along Corn Street, that Bristol risked becoming a picturesque relic, a city proud of what it had once been, rather than a city shaping what was still to come. This fear was not new precisely, but it had begun to sharpen into something more like resolve, a sense among the city's merchants and civic leaders that Bristol needed to do something bold enough to announce, to Liverpool and London and the wider world, that it still belonged among the first rank of maritime powers. It was in this atmosphere of pride, mixed uneasily with anxiety, that the idea of a great steamship began to take shape, not as a single sudden inspiration, but as a slow accumulation of conversations among men who had reason to care deeply about Bristol's future. There were shipowners who had watched steam prove itself on shorter routes and wondered what it might do given a larger hull and a longer voyage. There were engineers fascinated by the pure technical challenge of the thing, the question of whether a vessel could be built large enough to carry both the coal and ocean crossing would demand, and enough cargo and passengers to make the voyage profitable. And there were civic figures, aldermen and merchants and men of local influence, who saw in such a project not merely a commercial venture, but a statement, a way of declaring that Bristol intended to compete for the Atlantic trade on its own terms rather than watching it drift entirely toward the north. These conversations, scattered at first across dinners and committee rooms and the informal gatherings where men of business discussed the future of their city, began gradually to coalesce into something more organized, more deliberate, the beginnings of an actual company with actual capital behind it, formed for the specific and, to many observers, faintly reckless purpose of building a steamship larger than any that had yet attempted to cross the ocean. No one meeting marked the beginning of this effort with any particular drama. There was no single moment when the idea arrived fully formed, no dramatic unveiling before an astonished public. Instead, through the ordinary mechanisms by which ambitious men turn conversation into enterprise, a company began to take shape in Bristol in the early 1830s, its founders drawn from the ranks of local merchants and financiers who believed with the particular confidence of men who have not yet attempted the thing they are proposing, that Bristol could build a ship capable of crossing the Atlantic under steam power alone, reliably and profitably, and in doing so restore the city to a position of maritime importance it feared it was quietly losing. It was an ambition built as much on civic pride as on commercial calculation, though its founders would have insisted, and perhaps sincerely believed, that the two were inseparable. What this company needed now was direction, capital, and above all, a plan sturdy enough to survive contact with the difficulties that any attempt at something so unprecedented was certain to encounter, difficulties that even the most confident men in that Bristol boardroom could not yet fully imagine. The company that took shape in those Bristol meetings in the middle years of the 1830s called itself, with the plain confidence of the age, the Great Western Steamship Company. Its founders were merchants and bankers of the city, men who had grown prosperous on the old trades of wine and sugar and cotton, and who now looked at the widening reach of steam with a mixture of hunger and unease. They had watched, as had every port city in Britain, the slow retreat of Bristol's old standing against the rising weight of Liverpool and London, and they had come to believe, or had allowed themselves to be persuaded, that a bold stroke in steam navigation might reverse a decline that seemed otherwise settled and inevitable. The Atlantic crossing, still considered by most cautious men to belong properly to sail, was the prize they had fixed upon, and the instrument they proposed to seize it with was, at first, a modest and entirely sensible one. The plan, as it stood in the earliest meetings of the company, called for a wooden paddle steamer of respectable but unremarkable size, a vessel intended to serve as a companion and near sister to a ship already taking shape on the drawing boards of the same enterprise. That earlier vessel, which would in time become known to history as a fast and capable packet of the ordinary sort, was conceived along lines that any shipbuilder of the period would have recognized without hesitation. Wooden hull, paddle wheels, auxiliary sail, dimensions generous but not extraordinary. The company's directors, cautious men managing other men's money, saw in this plan a reasonable wager, an investment with a shape they understood and risks they believed they could measure. It was, by the standards of the boardroom, a safe ambition dressed in the language of daring, and for a time it seemed that this was the whole of what Bristol intended to build. But the company had, almost by accident of good fortune, attached to itself an engineer whose presence would prove impossible to contain within so modest a design. He had been brought into the enterprise not because anyone anticipated that he would reshape it entirely, but because his reputation for solving intractable problems made him a natural choice to sit on the committee overseeing construction of the first vessel. He arrived at those early meetings not as a naval architect, a title he did not hold and never claimed, but as a man whose mind moved instinctively toward the largest and most difficult version of any question put before it. Where others in the room saw a wooden steamer of ordinary proportions as the sensible limit of ambition, he saw instead a problem of engineering that had not yet been properly framed, let alone solved. His manner in these discussions was, by every surviving account, neither loud nor theatrical. He did not storm the boardroom with demands or attempt to overwhelm his fellow directors through force of personality alone. Instead, he brought to each meeting a quiet, almost maddening persistence, returning again and again to the same essential point, restated with fresh calculation and fresh evidence, until resistance to it began to seem less like prudence and more like a failure of nerve. He had noticed, and he pressed the observation with the patience of a man certain he was right, that the relationship between a ship's size and the power required to drive it through water was not a simple one. A larger vessel did not require proportionally more power to overcome the resistance of the sea, because that resistance grew with the surface of the hull while the capacity to carry coal and cargo grew with its volume. A ship twice as large, properly designed, might in fact prove more efficient rather than less, needing less coal relative to her burden, capable of carrying more passengers and freight for every ton of fuel consumed. It was a counterintuitive argument, and it ran against the instinct of nearly everyone else in the room, but he laid it out with such careful attention to figures and proportions that even skeptical men found themselves unable to dismiss it outright. The boardroom debates that followed stretched across many months, and the surviving minutes and correspondence of the company, incomplete as they are, suggest a slow and uneven process of persuasion rather than any single decisive moment of conversion. Shareholders, understandably, worried about capital already stretched thin by the first vessel now under construction. To commit to a second and far larger ship, one that had no precedent in the history of steam navigation, seemed to many a reckless multiplication of risk rather than a reasonable extension of it. There were directors who spoke plainly of ruin, who reminded their colleagues that shipbuilding was already a business littered with bankruptcies, born of exactly this kind of ambition, where men who dreamed past the edge of proven technique had lost fortunes and, in some cases, their reputations along with them. Others worried less about money than about the plain physical question of whether such a vessel could be built at all, whether any yard in Bristol possessed the capacity to raise a hull of the size now being proposed, and whether, once built, it could even be gotten out of the harbour and into open water. Against these doubts, the engineer offered not reassurance so much as further calculation. He did not deny the risks. He had never been a man to pretend difficulty away. Instead, he met each objection with a more detailed answer than the one before it, drawing on his understanding of iron and structure, of engines and coal consumption, of currents and tides in the very waters the company knew intimately, until the weight of his argument began to press more heavily on the boardroom than the weight of caution had. It helped, though it is difficult to say by how much, that he had already earned the company's confidence through his work on the first and more modest vessel, where his judgment on questions of construction had proven sound. Men who had watched him solve smaller problems correctly were inclined, however reluctantly, to extend him a measure of trust on the larger one. What tipped the balance, in the end, was not a single dramatic vote, but a slow accumulation of small surrenders, each director in turn deciding that the argument, however unsettling, could not honestly be refuted on its own terms. The company's chairman, a man of considerable local standing, whose support carried weight beyond his single vote, came around to the larger vision after long private conversation, and his conversion seemed to loosen something in the resistance of the others. There is a particular quality to institutional decisions of this kind, where caution does not so much vanish as simply exhaust itself against a patient and well-prepared argument. And something of that quality seems to have governed the Bristol boardroom through those months. By degrees, the modest wooden sister ship was set aside, and in its place rose the outline of something far stranger. A vessel built not of timber, but of iron, and larger by a considerable margin than any ship yet built by human hands for any purpose, warlike or commercial. The moment the company formally committed to this new design is not marked in the surviving records by any single dramatic resolution or triumphant announcement. It arrived instead as the quiet conclusion of a long argument, recorded in the dry language of minutes and resolutions, the sort of language that gives no hint of how strange the decision must have felt even to the men making it. They had begun by wanting a respectable wooden steamer to keep pace with the ambitions of rival ports. They ended by authorizing the construction of an iron ship larger than anything that had preceded it, a vessel whose very material was still regarded with suspicion by most of the shipbuilding world, and whose size alone would require solving problems that no dock, no crane, no yard in Bristol had ever been asked to solve before. It was a commitment made, in the end, not out of recklessness, but out of a kind of reluctant intellectual honesty, a boardroom persuaded against its own instincts by the patient, unrelenting clarity of one engineer's calculations. What remained now was to discover whether the world and the harbour of Bristol itself could accommodate what they had just agreed to build. The man responsible for that clarity was, by 1838, already something of a legend along the western railways and rivers of England, though he was not yet 40 years old. Isambard Kingdom Brunel had been building things that other engineers considered impossible for the better part of 15 years, and he had developed, in that time, a quiet and unshakable habit of being right about them. He had come to public notice first through the Thames Tunnel, a project begun under his father's direction and continued under his own hand after disaster and flooding had nearly ended it twice, and which had taught him, at an age when most engineers were still serving as junior assistants, exactly how unforgiving the gap could be between what was drawn on paper and what the earth or the water would actually permit. He had gone on to the Great Western Railway, laying its broad and, to some, needlessly generous gauge across the width of England, insisting that a wider track would ride steadier and faster than the narrower standard already favoured elsewhere, an argument he won not through charm but through the accumulation of measurements and results that were difficult to dispute. He had built the Clifton Suspension Bridge, not yet finished in that year but already famous in its ambition, a span meant to leap a gorge that most engineers would have judged unbridgeable by any means available at the time. Across all of it ran a single thread, noted by admirers and detractors alike. Brunel possessed almost no interest in doing a thing the way it had always been done, and considerable interest in discovering why it had always been done that way, and whether the reasons still held. It was this temperament, more than any particular expertise in ships, that had drawn him toward the question of a transatlantic steamer in the first place. The story, often repeated in the years afterward, held that Brunel had raised the idea almost as an aside during a Great Western Railway Board meeting when a colleague complained that the proposed rail line to Bristol was absurdly long for what it accomplished. Brunel is said to have replied that the line need not end at Bristol at all, that a passenger might simply continue by steamship the rest of the way to New York, and that the railway company might as well build the ship itself. Whether the exchange happened exactly as later told, the sentiment behind it was entirely consistent with the man. Distance was not, to Brunel, an obstacle to be respected so much as a problem to be resolved with sufficiently good engineering. The directors, perhaps to their own surprise, decided to take the suggestion seriously, and the company that would build the Great Western, and later the Great Britain, was the direct result. What set Brunel apart from most of his contemporaries in the shipbuilding trade was not simply his willingness to build large, but his particular reasoning for it, which ran directly against the instincts of nearly every experienced shipwright of his day. The common wisdom held that a larger wooden hull became progressively weaker and more dangerous as its length increased, since the strains of a ship flexing in a heavy sea grew faster than the timber's capacity to resist them, and a ship built much beyond the scale of existing vessels was widely assumed to be at serious risk of breaking her own back in open water. Brunel did not dispute the physics of the concern. He disputed its application. His argument, developed with the same patient calculation he had brought to bridges and tunnels, was that the resistance a ship met from wind and wave did not increase in direct proportion to her size, while her carrying capacity, her fuel efficiency, and crucially her structural strength, if properly engineered, could increase far more steeply. A larger ship, correctly built, would not be more fragile at sea, but more stable, more capable of carrying the fuel needed for a genuinely long ocean crossing, and less at the mercy of the particular wave or gust that might overwhelm a smaller vessel. It was a counterintuitive claim in an age when the largest ships afloat were already considered to be pushing near the outer edge of safe construction, and it was not an argument that persuaded easily. But Brunel had never much depended on ease of persuasion. He depended on the numbers holding up when someone finally checked them, and time and again they had. It was in the midst of settling this question of size that two further ideas arrived, almost as if summoned by the scale of the problem itself, and reshaped the entire project before a single iron plate had been ordered. The first was the growing use of iron in hull construction, a practice still confined mostly to small coastal vessels and barges, regarded by most naval architects as an interesting curiosity rather than a serious rival to timber for a vessel of any real size. Brunel had been watching the iron trade closely for other reasons entirely, through his railway work and his interest in bridge construction, and he understood iron's behavior under stress in a way that few shipbuilders of the period did. He recognized, before most of his contemporaries, that an iron hull would not merely be stronger than a wooden one at equivalent thickness, but could be built proportionally lighter for its strength, and could be built larger than timber construction would ever comfortably allow, since wood was ultimately limited by the length of a tree and the strength of a joint, while iron plates could be riveted into forms of nearly any size the yard could physically assemble. The second idea arrived almost by accident, in the form of the screw propeller, a device then being tested by only a handful of engineers and regarded with considerable skepticism by a shipping world still devoted to the paddle wheel. Brunel took an early and close interest in a small demonstration vessel fitted with a screw, and was sufficiently impressed by what he observed to begin quietly reconsidering the propulsion of his own ship, even as construction on her original design was already advancing. Neither iron construction nor the screw propeller had been part of the vessel's design when the keel arrangements were first drawn, and it says a great deal about the working culture Brunel had built around himself that both changes were absorbed into the project without the kind of institutional panic that might have accompanied them elsewhere. He surrounded himself with shipwrights and engineers who were, by most accounts, exacting to work for and occasionally exhausting, given to receiving detailed written instructions on matters that other engineers of the day would have left to a foreman's judgment, and given also to revising those instructions the moment new information made the old ones obsolete. But he was, by the same accounts, scrupulously respectful of genuine expertise once he trusted it, and men who worked closely with him over years rather than months tended to describe not resentment but a kind of hard-won loyalty, the sense of being asked more of than they had thought themselves capable of giving, and rising more often than not to meet it. It was this working relationship, tested and refined across the Thames Tunnel and the Great Western Railway, that he brought now to the yard at Bristol, where shipwrights trained entirely in timber were being asked to reconsider at his direction everything they had assumed about how a great hull ought to be built. The full weight of that reconsideration came to bear in a single, quiet decision. The ship had been under construction for some months already as a wooden paddle steamer, her frames laid according to conventional practice, when Brunel concluded, based on his study of iron and his growing confidence in the screw, that the vessel as designed no longer represented the best that could be built, and that building it anyway simply because work had already begun would be a failure of the very honesty that had brought the board around to a larger ship in the first place. There was no dramatic announcement recorded, no grand unveiling before the assembled directors. There was, instead, the slow and deliberate work of redrawing the plans entirely, discarding months of preparation, and committing the Great Britain to a form no one in Bristol or anywhere else had yet attempted at such a scale. an iron hull driven by a screw propeller larger than any merchant vessel yet built. The decision cost time, and it cost money the company did not entirely have to spare, and it asked the shipwrights of the yard to unlearn a trade they had spent years mastering. Brunel made it anyway, not out of restlessness or vanity, but because the numbers, once again, had told him it was the better ship, and he had long since stopped finding reasons to disagree with them. The question of iron was not a new one when it reached Bristol, but it had never before been asked at this scale, and scale changed everything. Iron ships existed already, small ones, built for canals and rivers and short coastal runs where the water stayed calm and the distances stayed modest. Barges, tugs, a handful of packet boats no longer than a terrace of houses plying quiet inland channels where a hull's failure meant at worst a soaking and a long walk home. No one had built an iron ship meant to cross an ocean, to meet the full weight of Atlantic swell and the twisting strain of a following sea, and no one could say with certainty what would happen when such a hull met such water. The shipwrights who had built in timber for generations understood their material the way a woodsman understands a forest, by long familiarity, by the grain and the give and the sound a good plank made under a mallet. Iron offered no such intimacy. It was cold, uniform, unforgiving in ways that timber was not, and it bent and failed according to rules that had only begun to be studied, mostly by engineers building bridges and boilers, men who had rarely, if ever, turned their calculations towards something meant to float. Brunel had spent enough of his career among ironworkers to trust the material more than most shipbuilders did. He had raised bridges from it, viaducts, the great tubular spans that carried his railway across valleys no timber structure could have managed. He knew iron's strength in tension, its behavior under load, the particular calculus of rivets and plates that let a structure carry weight far beyond what its bulk alone would suggest. What he did not know, what no one fully knew, was how that strength translated into a hull shape, curved and compound and subject to the endless flexing of waves, rather than the fixed geometry of a bridge span standing still above a valley. A bridge did not have to survive being lifted bodily by a swell and dropped again, twisting along its length as it fell. A ship did. The engineering was not simply a matter of scaling up what had worked in small iron vessels. It was a question of whether the entire premise held at a size 6 or 7 times greater than anything yet attempted. It was in search of an answer that Brunel went looking for proof already afloat, rather than proof still confined to calculation. Word had reached him of a vessel, iron-hulled, that had been sailing without incident for some time, quietly demonstrating in its ordinary service the very qualities he needed to confirm before he could commit the Great Western Steamship Company's resources to a hull of the same material at a scale no one had tried. He arranged to see her, to walk her decks and examine her plating, to ask the kind of patient, exhaustive questions that had become his habit whenever a new material or a new method presented itself. The ship was smaller than anything he intended to build, but she had done what mattered most. She had survived ordinary use, ordinary weather, ordinary years of service, without the iron betraying itself in the ways some had feared. Her hull had not corroded away beneath her, as skeptics warned iron surely would, exposed as it was to seawater and salt air in a way that made engineers accustomed to controlled industrial settings uneasy. She had not become, as some argued, a compass-scrambling mass of iron inevitably would, unnavigable by her own instruments, thrown wildly off course by the magnetic pull of her own hull. She had simply sailed season after season, and in her plain, uneventful record, Brunel found something more persuasive than any theoretical paper, evidence that the material could be trusted, at least at the scale already proven, and that the objections raised against it were, in practice, manageable rather than fatal. That visit settled one question, but it opened the door to a second, and this one had no ship already afloat to answer it by example, because the vessel Brunel now wanted to inspect represented something rarer still. The debate over propulsion had been running alongside the debate over hull material, and it was in its way just as consequential. Paddle wheels were the established method, the mechanism that had carried the company's first ship across the Atlantic and back without incident. familiar to engineers and captains and passengers alike. They were also, Brunel had come to believe, poorly suited to a vessel of iron and to a voyage of any real distance. Paddle wheels sat awkwardly on a hull's sides, vulnerable to damage in heavy seas, inefficient as a ship rolled and the wheels dipped unevenly into the water and demanding of a width and a structure that constrained the design of everything around them. There was another method, newer, far less proven, called the screw propeller, a submerged blade turning beneath the waterline, driven by the engine through a shaft running the length of the hull. In theory, it promised advantages paddle wheels could not match. A mechanism safely below the waves rather than exposed at the sides, undisturbed by the ship's roll, and a hull freed from the bulk and complication paddle wheels required. In practice, almost no one had built anything of consequence around it. It remained, in the assessment of most engineers and ship owners of the day, an interesting curiosity rather than a serious proposition for an ocean-crossing vessel. Brunel, characteristically, was not content to accept that assessment on the word of others. When he learned of a vessel fitted with a screw propeller and already at sea, he arranged, as he had with the iron hull, to see her for himself. The ship in question was modest, unglamorous, entirely unlike the grand transatlantic liner taking shape in his imagination, but she offered the same kind of evidence the iron-hulled vessel had offered, not theory, but demonstration. He watched her move, questioned her crew, examined the mechanism itself, the shaft and the blades and the coupling to the engine, working through in his mind whether the principle that moved this small vessel could be scaled to something many times her size. What he saw convinced him, and having been convinced, he did not do what a more cautious engineer might have done, which was to adopt the screw as a supplement, a hedge alongside the safer, familiar paddle wheels. He abandoned paddles entirely. The Great Britain, as he now intended her, would cross the ocean on the strength of a single propeller turned by her engines, a mechanism whose largest previous application had been a fraction of what he was now proposing, married to a hull built from a material whose largest previous application was smaller still. It was a decision that asked a great deal of faith from men who dealt, by profession, in certainty rather than faith. To build in iron alone was already a considerable risk, one that Brunel had satisfied himself was manageable through careful study of the vessel already afloat. To drive that iron hull by screw propeller alone was a second risk, layered atop the first, justified by a similarly careful inspection of a vessel whose scale bore little resemblance to the giant now rising in Bristol. Taken separately, each choice had evidence behind it, however slight. Taken together, they compounded into something no engineer before Brunel had attempted, an entirely untested combination, iron and screw at a size that dwarfed every precedent either technology could claim. If the iron hull failed in some way the smaller vessels had not revealed, the company would lose a fortune and possibly lives. If the screw propeller failed to scale as Brunel believed it would, the same iron hull that promised such strength would be left with no means of crossing an ocean at all, a helpless iron island adrift on the swells it had been built to conquer. Either failure alone would have been a serious setback. Both failing together or one triggering the other was the kind of prospect that kept the company's directors awake through long nights of correspondence and doubt. Brunel did not appear to share their sleeplessness, or if he did, he left little record of it. He had made his study, gathered his evidence from ships already afloat rather than ships still confined to drawings, and arrived, by the same patient method that had served him on the railways and the bridges, at a conclusion he trusted more than he trusted the comfort of precedent. The iron would hold, the screw would drive her. The compounding of two unproven ideas into a single hull was, in his accounting, not recklessness, but arithmetic, each risk weighed and found acceptable, and the sum of them still, in his judgment, the better ship than any timber, paddle-driven alternative the company might have built instead. Whether the arithmetic would hold once the ship met open water remained, for now, a question the dock at Bristol alone could not answer. The dock that would receive this reasoning had not been built for it. It had been built some years before when the Great Western Steamship Company laid down its first vessel, the timber-hulled paddle steamer that had carried the company's name across the Atlantic and returned with its reputation intact. That earlier ship had been large by the standards of her day, and the dock built to hold her during construction had seemed, at the time, generous beyond any foreseeable need. Now it seemed almost modest. The new hull, larger in every dimension that mattered, longer, deeper, wider in the beam than anything the yard's builders had first imagined housing, required the dock to be lengthened, its walls reinforced, its floor relaid to bear a weight of iron that no timber ship of comparable size had ever asked of the ground beneath it. The work of adapting the dock was, in its own right, no small undertaking, and it occupied the yard's labourers for months before a single plate of the ship herself was laid. Walls were extended stone by stone. Gates were rebuilt to swing wider. The dock, in effect, had to grow before the ship could grow inside it, and this slow enlargement of the space itself was the first sign, to anyone watching from the quay, that whatever was about to be built here would not resemble what had come before. The gathering of materials followed a similar pattern of expansion beyond precedent. Where a timber ship of this size would have called for the felling of whole forests, oak seasoned for years, curved timbers cut to match the shape of ribs and frames, this ship called instead for iron, delivered in plate and bar from foundries inland, brought down by cart and by rail to the water's edge and then into the dock itself. The tonnage required was considerable, and the company's agents spent long months securing supply from ironworks accustomed to producing for railways and bridges rather than for hulls, since no foundry in Bristol or elsewhere had yet been asked to supply iron in quantities such as this for a vessel meant to cross an ocean. Alongside the plate came the rivets, hundreds of thousands of them eventually, each one to be heated, driven and hammered into place by hand, a labour that would occupy iron workers for years rather than months. The company's records and the recollections preserved by those who wrote of the yard afterward describe a search for skilled hands that extended well beyond the usual circles of shipbuilding. Men were drawn from the railway works, where riveted iron had already become a familiar material in the building of bridges and rolling stock, and from bridge-building crews accustomed to working at height and in cold with hammer and hot iron. Shipwrights in the old sense, men trained in timber and the adze were present too, since much of the ship's fitting out, her masts, her decks, her interior joinery, would still call on their trade, but the hull itself, plate joined to plate along a keel and frame of iron, was work for a different kind of craftsman, and it was these men drawn from trades that had nothing to do with the sea, who set the character of the yard during the years the hull was rising. To stand at the dock at dawn in those years was to hear a shipyard that did not sound like a shipyard. The accounts that survive describe not the familiar rhythm of the adze biting into timber, nor the particular ring of a caulking mallet driving oakum into a seam, but the heavier, more percussive sound of hammers on hot iron, a sound that carried further and struck harder, echoing off the dock's stone walls in a way that timber work never had. Forges were kept lit through the working day, portable furnaces set along the length of the hull to heat rivets to a glow before they were carried, tongs in hand, to the men waiting at the plates. The work required teams, a man to heat the rivet, a man to carry it, a man to hold it in place from one side of the plate while another, on the far side, hammered it flat and tight, the four of them moving in a coordination that had to be learned and then repeated many thousands of times over before the hull was closed. In cold weather, the forges offered some comfort against the wind coming off the water, and in warm weather they made the dock a place of heat and glare that visitors described as closer to a foundry than a harbour. The dust and grit of ironwork settled over everything, a different residue than the sawdust and wood shavings that had covered every previous yard the company had built in, and it was this, more than any single measurement or figure, that told the men working there that something genuinely new was being attempted at Bristol. Overseeing this work, alongside Brunel himself, who visited the yard with a regularity that left its own mark on the memories of those employed there, was a small group of men entrusted with the daily direction of construction, men whose names appear in the company's correspondence and in the yard's surviving records, though rarely in the broader histories written afterward. A resident engineer held responsibility for translating Brunel's drawings into the daily instructions given to foremen and gangs, a task that demanded constant attention, since a design so unlike anything built before left little room for the kind of improvisation that experience might otherwise have supplied. Foremen drawn from the ironworking trades supervised the riveting gangs directly, moving along the scaffolding that rose alongside the hull, checking the fit of plates before they were joined and the tightness of rivets after. It was demanding, exacting work, made more difficult by the scale of the thing being built, since an error discovered late, after plates had already been joined along a run of many feet, could mean the laborious business of drawing rivets and refitting, a setback measured in days or weeks rather than hours. The patience required of these men, foremen and labourers alike, was of a particular kind, since the ship gave them no visible proof of progress in the early stages beyond the slow, incremental lengthening of an iron spine laid along the floor of the dock. That spine, the keel, was laid with a deliberateness that the company's own announcements took some care to describe, since the keel of an iron ship of this size carried a symbolic weight beyond its structural one. It was, in a sense, the company's public declaration that the design Brunel had argued for through months of committee debate was now irreversible, now a physical fact resting in iron along the dock floor rather than a proposal resting on paper. The laying of the keel drew a small gathering of directors and invited guests, though nothing so large or ceremonial as the launch itself would eventually draw, and the accounts of the occasion describe a modest gathering, appropriate to a beginning rather than a completion. From that first length of iron, the frames were raised in sequence, ribs of iron curving up from the keel in a rhythm that echoed, in shape if not in material, the timber frames of every wooden ship that had come before, a reminder that even so unfamiliar a material as iron was being bent, in the end, toward forms the shipbuilding trade already understood. The timeline the company had set for itself, and the patience it demanded of everyone connected with the work, stretched across several years rather than the single season that might have sufficed for a timber vessel of ordinary size. Delays accumulated for reasons both foreseeable and not. The difficulty of sourcing iron in the quantities required, the slow pace of a labor force still learning trades new to shipbuilding, the revisions Brunel himself introduced as the design matured under construction, since he was known to alter details even after work on them had begun, trusting his own judgment over the schedule the directors would have preferred. The company's shareholders, watching the years pass and the costs mount without a completed ship to show for them, grew restless in ways that surface in the correspondence of the period, letters urging haste, questions about expenditure, requests for assurance that the design would perform as promised. Brunel's answers, when they survive, are measured and confident, the same tone he had brought to his earlier defense of iron and the screw, an insistence that the ship being built in that dock, however slow her rising, however strange her sound and material to those accustomed to timber yards, would justify the years spent raising her once she finally left the dock and met the water for which she had been designed. Through the seasons that followed, the dock at Bristol became a place of steady, almost ritual labor, the kind that did not announce itself with sudden drama, but accumulated day upon day into something that had never before been seen in a British shipyard. The hull rose not as timber vessels rose, plank laid upon plank in a rhythm generations of shipwrights had known in their hands before they knew it in their minds, but plate by plate, iron sheet fitted to iron frame, each one measured, heated, curved where curving was needed, and set against its neighbor with a precision that the material itself demanded. Riveting was the heartbeat of the yard. Teams of men worked in pairs and trios, one holding the plate steady, another driving the rivet through with hammer and tongs, a third often crouched inside the hollow of the hull to catch the glowing shank and beat it flush on the far side so that the iron closed upon itself and would not loosen with the working of the sea. The sound of this labor was unlike anything the citizens of Bristol had heard from a shipyard before, where timber construction offered the dull knock of mallet on tree nail, the rasp of the saw, the occasional crack of a beam settling into place. The iron ship offered a continuous metallic clamor, a ringing that carried out over the dock walls and into the streets beyond, so that those who lived near the yard came to measure their days by it, waking to the first hammers and falling asleep, some claimed, still hearing the echo of the last. The public who gathered at the dock railings to watch this work were divided in their reactions, and the record of the period preserves both the wonder and the doubt in roughly equal measure. Some came simply to see the size of the thing, for even half finished, her frames rising bare against the sky before the plates closed them in. The hull already dwarfed every vessel that had ever been built in that yard, and there was a pleasure in that alone. The pleasure of witnessing something larger than experience had prepared one to expect. Others came with more skeptical purpose. Tradesmen and mariners who had spent their working lives around wooden ships and who regarded the iron rising before them with the particular suspicion reserved for materials that behaved according to rules no one present had learned as a child. They asked the questions that had troubled the company's directors from the earliest debates. Would iron rust through in a matter of seasons, weakened invisibly beneath a skin of scale until it failed without warning? Would the metal so unyielding to the eye prove brittle in ways that timber with its give and its flex had never been? Would a compass aboard a ship built entirely of iron even function? Or would the great mass of metal draw the needle from true and send the vessel wandering blind across an ocean with no way to correct her course? These were not idle questions. They touched on matters of life and cargo and the reputations of the men whose names were attached to the venture, and the shipwrights and engineers on site did not always have ready answers, because in many cases the answers did not yet exist. The ship being built at Bristol was, in a real sense, an experiment being conducted in full public view, its results to be read not in a laboratory, but in the ship's own behavior, once she met open water. The engineering challenges peculiar to iron construction revealed themselves gradually in details the timber trade had never needed to consider. Iron expanded and contracted with temperature in ways that could work a hull's fastenings loose if not accounted for in the design, and Brunel's engineers built allowances into the framing to absorb this movement rather than resist it outright. Rust, the great and constant enemy of the iron ship, required attention from the earliest stages, coatings and treatments applied to surfaces that would soon be sealed away behind decking and unreachable for years, so that a fault made now might not be discovered until the ship was far from any dock capable of repairing it. And there was the matter of sound and flex at sea, a concern no one could fully resolve on land, since a hull's true behavior under the working of waves could only be learned once it was afloat and burdened with the weight of engines, coal and cargo. Sailors who had spent decades aboard wooden vessels understood the language of a ship's timbers, the particular groans and creaks that told an experienced ear whether a vessel was sound or straining. Iron promised to speak a different language entirely, and no one at Bristol could yet say what that language would sound like, or whether the men who would eventually crew her would learn to read it in time to matter. Word of the ship's unprecedented size traveled well beyond Bristol's own streets, and the dock increasingly hosted visitors whose presence marked the venture as a matter of national and eventually international curiosity. Correspondents from London papers came to walk the scaffolding and report back to readers who had never seen an iron hull and struggled, by all accounts, to picture one from description alone. Engineers from rival yards came under less publicized circumstances, some out of professional respect for what Brunel and his associates were attempting, others simply to judge for themselves whether the reports of scale and material were exaggerated. Dignitaries, too, found their way to the dock, drawn by the same appetite for spectacle that had once brought crowds to view the launching of great warships, though this vessel was being built for peace and profit rather than for battle, a distinction the company's promoters were careful to emphasize in whatever publicity they arranged. Each visit added to the growing reputation of the ship before she had even taken her final form, and the directors, whatever their private anxieties over cost, understood the value of that attention and did little to discourage it. Amid this steady rise of iron and this traffic of onlookers, the work of fitting the ship's interior machinery proceeded on its own demanding schedule. The engine that would drive her, a vast assembly of cylinders and shafting built to a design suited to the unusual demands of turning a screw rather than paddle wheels, had to be lowered into the hull in sections too heavy and too awkward for anything but careful, coordinated labor, block and tackle straining under loads the dock had rarely been asked to bear. Once inside, the pieces had to be aligned and bolted with a precision that left no margin for the kind of adjustment a timber ship's simpler machinery might have tolerated. The screw propeller itself, still an unproven device for a vessel of this size, required its own long chain of fitted parts, a shaft running the length of the stern that had to be bored true and set without the slightest deviation, for any flaw in that alignment would announce itself at sea in vibration, wasted power, or worse. The men responsible for this work operated with none of the public attention lavished on the visible rise of the hull, laboring instead in the enclosed, poorly lit spaces below deck where the true mechanical heart of the ship was taking shape, unseen by the crowds at the railings, but no less essential to whether she would ever prove herself capable of the crossing she had been designed to make. All of this, the iron and the riveting, the engine and the shaft, the visits and the growing fame, came at a cost that mounted with a persistence the company's directors found increasingly difficult to absorb. Construction that had been projected to conclude within a modest span of time stretched onward past its early estimates, each new challenge in the ironwork or the machinery adding weeks the original budget had not anticipated. The correspondence of the period carries the strain plainly. Letters from shareholders and directors pressing for clearer timelines, for firmer assurances that the money already committed would not simply vanish into further delay. There is a restlessness in these exchanges that speaks to more than simple impatience, a genuine anxiety among men who had staked considerable sums on a vessel whose eventual success remained, for all the confidence of her designer, still unproven. Brunel's replies, where they survive, hold to the same measured certainty he had shown from the earliest debates over iron and the screw, an insistence that the ship rising so slowly and so strangely in that dock would answer every doubt raised against her once she finally left Bristol and met the ocean she had been built to cross. By the time she stood complete within her dock, the ship that had begun as a question of iron and steam had become something the shipwrights themselves seemed almost reluctant to call finished, as though any final word might diminish what had taken so long to raise. She measured some 322 feet from bow to stern, a length that even those accustomed to her slow emergence from the timber staging found difficult to hold in the eye all at once. To stand at her bow and look toward her stern was to lose the far end in a kind of perspective more familiar to the builders of cathedrals than to the builders of ships, the line of her running on and on until it seemed to belong less to a vessel than to a piece of altered coastline. Her iron hull, riveted in overlapping plates from keel to upper works, held a color unlike any timber hull afloat, a dark gray that shifted toward black in shadow and toward a dull, watery silver where the light caught her wet flanks at the tide line. Those who had grown up along the Bristol docks, accustomed to the warm ochre and tar black of wooden ships, found in her color something faintly unsettling, though few could say precisely why iron unsettled them where timber never had. Perhaps it was simply that wood had always seemed a material the sea might in time reclaim, while iron seemed to belong to no natural order at all, a stone that had somehow been persuaded to float. 6 masts rose from her deck, in an arrangement that struck visitors as almost contradictory, an old world of canvas and rigging set above a hull built for an age of engines. The masts were not disguised or diminished for the sake of the machinery below. They stood as full and functional as on any sailing ship, rigged to carry sail across a spread of canvas sufficient, in the right wind, to drive her onward without a single turn of her engine. Brunel had insisted upon this from the earliest drawings, unwilling to trust the ocean crossing entirely to a mechanism as new and unproven as the screw. And so the finished ship carried within her a kind of quiet redundancy, 2 separate systems of propulsion coexisting rather than competing, the sailing ship and the steamship joined in a single iron body. Sailors who had spent their lives aboard vessels of one persuasion or the other found her rigging both familiar and strange, the ropes and yards recognizable enough in their arrangement, yet oddly proportioned against a hull that dwarfed anything they had previously climbed. Below the deck, where the masts gave way to the machinery that made her singular among the ships of her age, the engine room opened into a space that visitors described, when permitted to see it, with a hush usually reserved for places of worship. The cylinders stood taller than a man, their iron surfaces catching the lantern light in long, curved gleams, connected by a web of rods and cranks whose motion, even at rest, seemed to promise a violence of movement that the stillness of the dock could not yet reveal. The engine had been designed to turn not the great paddle wheels that drove every other steamship of consequence afloat, but a screw set beneath the stern, a mechanism whose logic Brunel had defended through years of argument, and whose presence in the finished ship marked perhaps her most radical departure from everything that had come before her. Where paddle wheels churned visibly at the waterline, announcing a ship's power to any who watched from shore, the screw worked unseen beneath the hull, its turning felt in the water rather than witnessed upon it, a change that some engineers still regarded with suspicion, even as the ship that would prove its worth sat finished before them. The mechanism connecting cylinder to screw ran through a shaft of a scale rarely attempted before, a single continuous length of iron whose manufacture had tested the limits of the very foundries that produced her plates, and whose successful completion Brunel treated less as an engineering triumph than as a simple confirmation of what careful calculation had always promised. Above this machinery, and separated from it by decks designed to muffle both the sound and the heat of the engines, lay the accommodations built for the passengers who would eventually cross the ocean within her iron walls. Here the ship abandoned entirely the plain, functional character of her lower works and took on something closer to the grandeur of a great house transplanted to sea. The dining saloon ran the length of a considerable stretch of deck, its ceiling supported by columns finished to resemble palm trees, an ornamental conceit that struck visitors as almost whimsical against the surrounding iron, as though the ship wished to remind her passengers that, however novel her construction, the comforts of ordinary life had not been left behind on the quay. Long tables ran beneath skylights that admitted a soft, diffused daylight during the hours of calm weather, and the walls were finished in a manner meant to recall the panelled rooms of fashionable hotels rather than the closed, dark timber of an ordinary ship's cabin. A promenade deck, open to the air and sheltered where possible from spray, offered passengers a place to walk the length of the vessel much as they might walk along a seaside terrace, a deliberate gesture toward the idea that a long crossing need not be endured in confinement, but might instead be passed in something resembling leisure. The cabins themselves, though modest by the standards of a great house, exceeded by a considerable margin what most ocean travelers of the age had come to expect. Berths were arranged to allow a measure of privacy rare aboard ship, and the finishing throughout, from the brass fittings to the patterned carpets laid along the corridors, spoke to a conviction on the part of the ship's builders that comfort and iron construction were not, as some had feared, incompatible. Where the earliest skeptics of iron shipbuilding had imagined a hull that would carry all the coldness and hardness of its material into every corner of the vessel, the finished ship offered instead rooms warmed by careful design, insulated as far as the age allowed from the chill that iron might otherwise have imposed upon a long Atlantic passage. It was, in its way, an argument as deliberate as any Brunel had made in the shipyards and boardrooms of Bristol, an argument conducted not in words but in velvet and brass and polished wood, insisting silently that the future of ocean travel need sacrifice nothing of its dignity to the demands of a new material. At her bow, beneath the long line of her prow, a figurehead had been fitted in the old manner, carved and gilded, a final ornamental gesture that seemed almost to apologize for the plainness of the iron surrounding it. It was a small thing against the scale of the ship, easily overlooked by visitors whose eyes were drawn instead to the sheer improbable length of her hull, yet its presence mattered to those who had built her, a reminder that however far the ship departed from the wooden vessels that preceded her, she remained in spirit a ship still, entitled to the same small dignities that sailors had long extended to the vessels that carried them. The balance struck throughout her construction, between the unadorned iron necessity of her hull and the careful ornament applied wherever function permitted, reflected a philosophy that ran through the entire enterprise, a conviction that grandeur and utility were not opposing principles but two expressions of the same underlying ambition. By the time all this stood finished within the dock, The ship no longer resembled the uncertain, half-formed thing that had occupied the anxious letters of her directors through the long years of her building. She sat complete, her iron hull catching what light reached down into the enclosed water around her, her 6 masts rising bare of sail against the grey Bristol sky, her interior fitted and furnished for a voyage she had not yet made. Visitors who came to view her before her launch spoke of a scale that seemed to alter their sense of what a ship might be, an impression not easily shaken even by those who had spent their lives among the vessels of the port. She was larger than anything the public of that age had seen afloat, and she waited now in her dock with the particular stillness of a thing built for motion, complete at last, and known only by rumour and report to the ocean she had been made to cross. Before she could know the ocean at all, she had first to know the river, and even that modest distance would prove no simple matter. A ship of her size had never been built inside the dock at Bristol, and no one had reckoned, until the hour drew near, how narrow the way out might prove to be. The dock gates and the stone locks that separated her basin from the tidal reach of the Avon had been built for vessels of an older and smaller age, and the Great Britain, broad in the beam and heavy in her iron plating, would not pass through them as they stood. Engineers who had spent years absorbed in the construction of her hull now turned their attention to the humbler problem of the walls around her, and the solution, when it came, was itself a small act of demolition. A portion of the lock had to be removed entirely, the masonry cut away and rebuilt to a wider measure so that the ship might slip through a gate that had, until that summer, been too narrow to admit her. It was a strange labour to watch, men chiselling at stone to make room for iron, and it spoke plainly of how far the ambitions of the shipwrights had outrun the ordinary dimensions of the port that had made her. Even with the walls widened, the passage remained a matter of tides. The Avon at Bristol rose and fell with a force that shaped the whole rhythm of the harbour, and only at the height of a suitably high tide would there be water enough beneath her keel to carry so deep a hull over the sills and out into the river proper. The calculations were exacting, for a ship of her displacement drew far more water than the vessels the dock had been designed to serve, and a misjudged hour could leave her grounded in full view of the crowd, an indignity no one connected with her construction wished to risk. The date was fixed with these tides in mind, and as it approached, a certain quiet tension settled over the men who had built her, a tension not born of doubt in the ship herself, but in the narrow margins of water and timing on which her release now depended. The 19th of July in the year 1843 was chosen as the day of her launch, and Bristol prepared for it as though the whole of the city's pride had been poured, along with so much iron, into her hull. It was decided that the occasion would be graced by royalty, and Prince Albert, husband to the young Queen Victoria, agreed to travel from London to perform the ceremony himself, an honour that lent to the day a note of national significance beyond the interests of the port alone. His arrival was met with the ordinary pageantry of such visits, banners and addresses, and the assembling of local dignitaries eager to be seen beside so great a personage on so great an occasion. And for a few hours the attention of the city turned as much to the prince as to the ship he had come to launch. Yet beneath the ceremony, among those who understood what the day actually required, there remained a quieter apprehension. The men of the Great Western Steamship Company, and Brunel among them, knew that royal presence could adorn a launch, but could not guarantee its success. A ship's first movement from dry construction into open water was always a moment of exposure, the point at which a vessel built and admired in stillness first had to prove herself capable of the simplest task asked of any boat, that of floating true and moving as intended. For a hull as large and as unusual as this one, built of iron rather than the timber that generations of shipwrights had learned to judge by instinct, that first movement carried a weight of uncertainty that no amount of ceremony could entirely dispel. Brunel, watching the preparations with the same close attention he had given every other stage of her construction, understood better than most how much still depended on tide and timber shoring and the careful judgment of the men managing her lines. The ceremony itself proceeded with the modest formality suited to such occasions. Prince Albert performed the naming, and there was the customary breaking of a bottle against her hull, a small human gesture set against the enormous fact of the iron body it was meant to bless. The crowds that had gathered along the dockside and on the surrounding walls watched with the particular hush that attends a moment everyone present understands to be historic, even if few could have explained precisely why. It was not a spectacle of grandeur to rival the ship's own scale. There were no great fireworks, no elaborate processions beyond the ordinary movements of dignitaries from carriage to platform, and the ceremony, set beside the audacity of what it celebrated, seemed almost restrained. A vessel that would carry the ambitions of an age toward the ocean was sent on her way with little more than a broken bottle, a royal handshake, and the assembled attention of a provincial crowd, a modesty that some who wrote of the day found faintly striking, given what she represented. Then came the float-out itself, and it did not proceed as smoothly as the ceremony might have suggested. The tide, though chosen with care, did not rise quite so generously as had been hoped, and for a time it seemed the great hull might not clear the sills of the lock at all. Men worked the lines and capstans with mounting urgency as the water reached its height and began, almost imperceptibly, to recede again, aware that the margin between success and failure was measured now in inches rather than hours. There was a period of real difficulty in which the ship, so recently the object of royal ceremony, sat stubborn against the walls of her own dock, resisting the modest push of water and rope that was meant to carry her free. It took the concerted effort of the dock workers, adjusting her position by degrees, coaxing her hull along the tightened lines, before she finally began to move. First with a hesitance that seemed to mock the confidence of the morning, and then, as the tide caught properly beneath her, with the slow and deliberate motion of a very large thing finally consenting to be moved. The crowds who watched from the walls and the surrounding quays saw, in the end, not a dramatic surge into open water, but a patient, almost laborious passage, the great black hull sliding by degrees through the widened gate and into the tidal reach of the Avon, watched by thousands who had come expecting spectacle and received instead a demonstration of just how much labor and calculation was required to move something built on so unprecedented a scale. There was cheering, certainly, and a sense of relief once she cleared the lock cleanly. But the abiding impression left on many who wrote of the day was of effort rather than triumph, of a ship whose very success in floating seemed to depend on the narrowest of margins rather than any easy inevitability. Once free of the dock, she lay at last upon the river that had watched over her construction for years, her hull riding the water with the low, settled grace that had eluded every effort to picture her under sail. It was, by any measure, a considerable achievement. The safe delivery of the largest ship yet built from the confines of a dock too small for her into the open water she had been designed to master. And yet those who understood the fuller shape of her purpose knew that this day marked only the first and smallest of the journeys asked of her. She had crossed a lock, not an ocean. She had proven that she could float, not that she could cross the Atlantic in the face of storm and swell, nor that her iron plates and her novel engines would answer every demand the sea might make of them. Before her still lay months of fitting out, of trials upon the river and beyond it, of adjustments to engines and rigging discovered only once she moved beneath her own power. The tide that carried her from the dock that July afternoon was generous enough for the modest distance required, but the far larger tide of the ocean waited elsewhere, unmoved by ceremony, indifferent to the cheering crowds, patient in the way that only the sea can be patient, for a ship that had, as yet, only begun to learn what she was. The months that followed the launch were quieter than the day itself, though no less demanding of those who had brought the ship into being. Fitting out proceeded through the autumn and into the following year, a slow accumulation of decisions made in workshops and on deck, each one small in itself, each one necessary to the whole. Engines that had been assembled in sections were coupled and tested, their motions checked against calculations that had, until now, existed only on paper. Rigging was set up and adjusted, the great iron hull learning to carry canvas as well as steam, for her builders had not abandoned the older ways entirely, but had chosen instead to marry them to the new. Cabins were finished in wood and brass, The comfort of passengers considered alongside the endurance of the machinery that would carry them. There was, in this period, a particular kind of patience required. The patience of testing, of small failures corrected, of a ship revealing herself gradually to the men who had built her, as though she too were learning her own capabilities. Trials upon the river came first, cautious excursions along the same waters that had carried her to her launching, the engines turning at low power while engineers listened for irregularities in their rhythm, watched for heat where there ought to be none, measured the ship's response to her own considerable weight in motion. These trials were not without their small alarms, moments when a bearing ran hotter than expected, when a valve required adjustment, when the propeller's motion through the water produced vibrations that had to be traced to their source and understood. But each difficulty, once found, proved answerable, and the ship's builders allowed themselves, cautiously, a growing confidence. Brunel himself was present for a portion of these trials, watching with the same close attention he had given to every stage of her construction, aware that the true test of his design lay not in the calm waters of a river, but in the open ocean, where wind and current would ask questions no dock trial could anticipate. When at last she moved beyond the river and into open water for her sea trials, the ship performed in a manner that eased, though did not entirely still, the concerns of those who had staked so much upon her. Her iron hull answered the sea's motion differently than a wooden ship would have, with a stiffness that some aboard found unfamiliar, a directness of response that spoke of her unusual construction. Her engines drove her steadily through moderate swells, and when her sails were set alongside the steam, she carried both with a competence that suggested her builder's faith in the marriage of old method and new had not been misplaced. There remained, among those who had watched her rise from her ribs at the dock, a lingering uncertainty, for no one could say with complete confidence what a crossing of thousands of miles would ask of iron plates and novel engines that a few days of coastal trial could not reveal. But the optimism that had accompanied her launching had, by the time she was pronounced ready, matured into something more grounded. Not certainty, for certainty was not yet available to anyone regarding a ship of this kind, but a considered confidence born of careful work and cautious testing. The maiden voyage to New York began in the summer of 1845, the ship departing from Liverpool, where she had gone to take on her full complement of passengers and cargo, the Avon estuary and Bristol having served their purpose in her building and launching, but Liverpool now serving as the gateway for the crossing itself. She carried a modest number of passengers for so grand a vessel, the public not yet entirely persuaded that an iron ship could be trusted with human cargo across such a distance, along with crew who managed her engines and her rigging with the particular vigilance required of men serving aboard something genuinely new. The crossing itself unfolded over a little more than 2 weeks, the ship making her way westward under steam through calm stretches and rough alike, her sails filled when the wind served and furled when it did not, the two systems of propulsion working in the kind of cooperation her designers had intended from the earliest sketches. Accounts from those aboard describe a voyage marked by a steadiness that surprised passengers accustomed to the pitch and roll of wooden ships. The iron hull, heavier and stiffer than timber construction, met the ocean's swells with less of the violent motion that had made ocean travel an ordeal for generations of travelers. Below decks, the engines produced a continuous low thrum that became, within days, simply the sound of the ship herself, a mechanical heartbeat that passengers grew accustomed to hearing at all hours, whether waking or attempting to sleep. The dining saloon, finished with the same care given to every visible surface of the ship, offered a setting of unexpected elegance for a vessel still regarded by many as an experiment. Meals were served at set hours, conversation turned inevitably to the novelty of the crossing itself, and passengers who had booked passage more from curiosity than necessity found themselves, by the voyage's midpoint, settling into a rhythm that felt, however strange the vessel beneath them, increasingly ordinary. When she arrived in New York Harbor, the reception awaiting her exceeded what even her builders might have hoped. Crowds gathered along the waterfront to see the great iron ship that had crossed an ocean, drawn by reports that had traveled ahead of her. carried by earlier vessels and by the simple, urgent curiosity of a public unaccustomed to ships built of metal succeeding at voyages that Wood had always claimed as its own domain. Newspapers in the city gave considerable attention to her arrival, describing her dimensions, her engines, her propeller, in language that mixed genuine technical interest with something closer to wonder. Reporters who came aboard to inspect her wrote accounts for readers who had never seen a ship like her and might reasonably have doubted such a vessel could exist at all, let alone cross the Atlantic successfully. The notion of iron floating, of iron carrying passengers safely across the ocean's full breadth, remained for many a proposition that defied common sense, and her arrival in New York did more to settle that argument than any amount of calculation or testimony could have done from a distance. For those who walked her decks in that period, whether passengers who had made the crossing or visitors come merely to see her at anchor, there was a particular quality to the experience that those who wrote of it struggled fully to convey. She did not look from a distance, so very different from other great ships of her era. Her masts and rigging maintained a familiar silhouette against the sky. But aboard her, in the sound of her engines, in the steadiness of her iron hull against the sea, in the sheer improbable fact of her existence and her successful crossing, there was the unmistakable sense that something had shifted. She was not merely a larger ship or a faster one, though she was both of these things. She represented, to those who understood what her iron construction meant for the future of ocean travel, the arrival of a genuinely different kind of vessel, one that suggested Wood's long dominance of shipbuilding might not extend indefinitely into the future. This sense did not last in its purest form. For very long, history rarely allows such moments to remain suspended in their initial brightness. Other ships would follow. Other builders would refine what she had first demonstrated, and within years the particular wonder attached to an iron ship crossing the Atlantic would fade into simple expectation, the marvel of one decade becoming the unremarkable standard of the next. But for those brief weeks in the summer of 1845, standing on a Liverpool quay or a New York wharf, watching an iron hull ride the ocean's swell with a steadiness no wooden ship could quite match, there were people who understood, with a clarity that later years would only confirm, that they were witnessing something genuinely new settle into the world. The future of ocean travel, however gradually it would still need to arrive in its fuller form, had shown itself, briefly and unmistakably, in the shape of a single ship crossing a single ocean, her iron plates and her novel engines having answered, after all, every demand the sea had made of them. She did not hold her place for long. This was, perhaps, the truest lesson the Great Britain had to teach, though it was not one anyone could have spoken aloud at her launch, when she seemed to stand so far beyond every other vessel afloat that comparison itself felt almost beside the point. Size, it turned out, was not a throne, but a passing position on a road that other builders were already surveying, other yards already clearing, other engineers already sketching in notebooks that would soon enough produce hulls larger than hers. The wooden giants that had come before her, the great East Indiamen, the ships of the line with their towering rigging, the packet ships that had carried mail and passengers across the Atlantic in the years before steam made such crossings a matter of schedule rather than fortune, had each in their turn represented the outer limit of what shipwrights believed timber and rope could achieve. The Great Britain had answered them not by extending that limit, but by discarding the material on which it depended, and in doing so she had opened a door that others, once shown it existed, could not resist walking through with increasing ambition. The contest, once begun, did not pause to admire what had made it possible. Within a handful of years of her launch, other companies and other engineers were laying down iron hulls of their own, some larger, some faster, some carrying more passengers or more cargo across the same stretches of ocean she had crossed. The Great Western Steamship Company, having staked its fortune and its reputation on the ship Brunel had built for them, found itself in the uncomfortable position of watching rivals absorb the lesson of iron and steam more quickly, in some respects, than the very yard that had pioneered it. Liverpool and Glasgow builders, quick to see what Bristol had proven, began producing hulls of riveted plate with an efficiency that Bristol's own dock, cramped and difficult as it had always been, could not easily match. The names of these rival ships have mostly faded from common memory, absorbed into the general history of Atlantic steam rather than remembered individually. But in their own time, they were formidable competitors, and the companies that owned them fought for passengers and cargo with an intensity that mirrored, in commercial terms, the engineering intensity of the years just past. Fares were cut, departure schedules were tightened, advertisements in Liverpool and New York newspapers boasted of speed and comfort in language that grew more extravagant with each new launch, each company insisting that its ship, not some rivals, represented the true future of ocean travel. It was, in this atmosphere, a genuinely brief reign that the Great Britain enjoyed as the largest ship afloat. The title she had claimed at her launch, with such evident justice, belonged to her for what modern reckoning suggests was scarcely more than a few years before other hulls, built with the lessons of her own construction firmly in mind, exceeded her dimensions. This was not a failure on her part, nor any diminishment of what she had achieved. It was rather the ordinary fate of anyone who builds the first version of something that others will spend the following decades refining. The first iron ship to cross an ocean under her own steam and screw propulsion had done something that no later, larger vessel could ever quite repeat, however much steel and length they might add to their hulls. But records of size once set exist to be broken, and the shipbuilding world of the 1840s and 50s broke them with a regularity that must have been sobering to watch from Bristol, where the company that had financed her felt the weight of her enormous cost pressing against revenues that never quite matched the ambitions that had produced her. Later, ships would grow larger still, some of them dramatically so, built by engineers who had learned from Brunel's example even as they exceeded it. And in time, the very notion of what counted as an ocean liner would expand to encompass vessels the Great Britain's builders could scarcely have envisioned, floating structures of such length and displacement that her own considerable dimensions would come to seem, in retrospect, almost modest. This was the price and also the point of having built genuinely first. To be surpassed was not an insult, but a confirmation that the path she had opened was one others found worth following, again and again, into scales of construction that kept expanding for the remainder of the century and well beyond it. The Great Western Steamship Company, meanwhile, found itself unable to sustain the financial burden that the Great Britain's construction and operation represented, and by the early 1850s the ship passed out of the hands of the men who had commissioned her, sold to new owners who saw in her not a flagship of transatlantic prestige, but a durable, capacious vessel suited to a different kind of trade entirely. It was around this time that gold had been discovered in Australia, and the resulting surge of emigration created a demand for ships capable of carrying very large numbers of passengers across a distance far greater than the Atlantic crossing for which she had originally been designed. The Great Britain was refitted for this purpose. Her engines adjusted, her passenger accommodations reconfigured to hold far more people than her original Atlantic service had ever required, and she began a new career that would occupy her for a far longer span of years than her brief and celebrated time on the Bristol to New York run. The Australia voyages were nothing like the crossings that had first made her famous. Where the Atlantic run had lasted a matter of weeks, the journey to Melbourne or Sydney stretched to 2 months or more, carrying her far south into the cold latitudes below Africa before she turned east across the vast emptiness of the Southern Ocean. A passage that tested endurance in ways the North Atlantic, for all its storms, had never quite demanded. She carried emigrants by the thousands over the course of her many voyages in this trade, families and single men and women leaving behind a country that many of them would never see again, drawn by the promise of gold or land, or simply distance from lives that had offered them little. She carried, on occasion, soldiers as well, pressed into service as a transport during the Crimean War, in a brief interruption of her regular Australian schedule, her hull proving as adaptable to the movement of troops as it had to the movement of hopeful emigrants, a versatility that spoke to the fundamental soundness of what Brunel and his shipwrights had built into her from the beginning. It was in this long service, unglamorous compared to the fanfare of her Atlantic debut, that the Great Britain's true durability revealed itself most clearly. She was by this point no longer the largest ship afloat, nor the fastest, nor the subject of the newspaper attention that had once tracked her every movement with such fascination. Newer ships, built by companies that had learned every lesson her construction had to teach and applied them with fewer of the difficulties that had attended her own building, began to eclipse her in the public imagination, their launches celebrated with the same enthusiasm that had once been reserved for her. But she continued to sail, voyage after voyage, decade after decade, her iron hull showing none of the fatigue that might have been expected of a wooden vessel subjected to such sustained and demanding service. She required repair, of course, and periodic refitting, and at least one occasion when damage to her engines led her owners to remove them entirely and convert her, for a time, to sail alone. A curious reversal of the very innovation that had first defined her, though one that spoke less to any failure of the iron and more to the practical economics of long-distance trade in that era. Even reduced in this way, she continued to carry passengers and cargo reliably across the world's oceans, a workhorse where she had once been a wonder, valued now for her capacity and her soundness rather than for the novelty that had first made her famous. There was something quietly remarkable in this second life, longer by far than the celebrated first one, and it was here, in the unglamorous years of steady service rather than in the fanfare of her launch, that the deepest measure of Brunel's achievement perhaps lay. Other ships had already surpassed her in size and speed and public attention, and would go on doing so with increasing regularity as the century advanced. But few of them would match her for sheer duration. For the number of years, she continued to answer, faithfully and without complaint, whatever demands were placed upon her iron frame. Yet before that long duration could even begin to accumulate, before the decades of faithful service could stack themselves one atop another into the record that later generations would admire, the ship first had to survive a single autumn night that came very near to ending her story altogether. It happened not far into her working life, only a few years after the crowds had watched her glide down the Bristol dock and out into open water, and it happened, as these things so often do, through a combination of ordinary error and extraordinary weather that no one on board had fully anticipated. She was outbound from Liverpool, bound once again for New York, carrying passengers who had chosen her for exactly the qualities Brunel had built into her, the promise of speed, of iron strength, of a crossing made safer by size rather than more dangerous by it. The captain that voyage, a man new to her particular handling and unfamiliar with the currents of the Irish Sea in the way that her earlier commanders had been, misjudged his position as darkness fell and a storm rose around them. The charts of the period, by the account of those who later reviewed them, were themselves imperfect in places, marking a light that did not exist and omitting hazards that did. Whatever the precise chain of misfortune, the result was the same. Sometime in the small hours, with wind and rain lashing at her decks, the great ship ran hard onto the sands of Dundrum Bay on the northern coast of Ireland and came to a shuddering, grinding halt that no engine built by human hands could reverse. For a vessel of her size, grounding on an open, exposed beach was not a small misfortune to be corrected with a single tide. She had gone in at speed, driven by wind and wave, and the sands beneath her had received the whole weight of her iron hull in one prolonged and grinding impact. The passengers were brought off safely, that much at least the accounts agree upon without dispute, but the ship herself remained stranded and immovable, exposed to every subsequent storm that came rolling in off the Atlantic through the remainder of that autumn and on into the following winter. Efforts to free her began almost immediately and continued, with mounting difficulty and mounting cost, for nearly a year. Engineers were sent from Bristol. Local labor was hired by the score. Various schemes were attempted, some more promising than others, attempts to lighten her by removing cargo and machinery, attempts to dig channels in the sand around her hull, attempts to use the rise and fall of the tide itself to work her gradually free. Each failed in turn, or succeeded only partially, only for the next storm to undo whatever progress had been made and drive her further into the sand, or batter her plates in new places, or threaten to break her back entirely against the unyielding ground beneath her. Brunel himself, by the accounts of those who corresponded with him during this period, took the grounding with a mixture of frustration and grim determination that those who had worked with him before would have recognized well. He traveled to the site more than once, examined the ship's condition personally, and eventually proposed the solution that would, in time, succeed where so many smaller efforts had not: the construction of a proper breakwater, built specifically to shelter her from the worst of the sea's assault, while more patient efforts continued to work her free. It was not a quick fix. It was not, in truth, a solution at all in the sense of restoring her swiftly to service. It was simply the most sensible way of buying enough calm water and enough time for the slower, steadier work of freeing an iron hull from sand to proceed without being undone every few weeks by the next gale. It took, in the end, very close to a full year before she was finally refloated and brought back around to Liverpool for the extensive repairs her hull now required. A year is a long time for any ship to sit idle, generating no revenue, earning no fares, carrying no cargo. And for the Great Western Steamship Company, already operating on margins thinner than its founders had once imagined, that year proved close to ruinous. The company had committed enormous sums to her construction from the very beginning, sums that had stretched its resources even before she ever touched water, and the returns from her early voyages, however celebrated in the newspapers, had never been quite sufficient to recoup that initial investment at the pace her directors had hoped. Now, on top of the original debt, came the costs of salvage, the engineers' fees, the labor, the breakwater itself, the insurance disputes that inevitably followed an incident of this scale, and finally the bill for repairs to a hull that had spent the better part of a year grinding against sand and stone in an exposed bay. It was, by any reasonable measure, more than the company could bear. The gap between what Brunel had envisioned for this ship, a vessel of unmatched capability, a flagship for a new age of iron and steam, and the harsher arithmetic of what it actually cost to build, insure, and recover. Such a vessel had never been more starkly exposed. Ambition, however sound in engineering terms, does not by itself keep a company solvent, and the Great Western Steamship Company, having staked so much of its identity and its capital on this single extraordinary hull, found itself unable to absorb a setback of this magnitude. Within a relatively short span of years following her recovery, the company that had commissioned her, that had watched her rise in the dock at Bristol and celebrated her launch with such civic pride, was forced to sell her. She passed in this way out of the hands of her original owners and into those of Gibbs, Bright and Company, a Liverpool firm with different priorities and a different vision for what such a ship might yet accomplish. It was not perhaps the ending anyone in Bristol had imagined for her on the day of her launch, when the crowds had gathered and the dignitaries had spoken of pride and progress and the future of British engineering. There is something sobering in tracing that arc, from civic triumph to financial exhaustion in the space of only a few years, and it would be easy to read the grounding at Dundrum Bay as the moment when Brunel's grand vision met its practical limits, the point at which iron and ambition collided with sand and economics and came away diminished. And yet the ship herself, whatever the fate of the company that built her, proved remarkably undiminished by the experience. Under her new owners, she was extensively refitted, her engines adjusted, her role reconsidered entirely. No longer the flagship of a transatlantic mail service, but instead a vessel suited to the long, demanding voyages to Australia that the era of gold rushes and mass emigration now demanded in growing numbers. She returned to sea not as a symbol of one company's ambition, but simply as a working ship, carrying emigrants and cargo across enormous distances with a steadiness that belied the disaster she had so narrowly survived. The iron that had ground against the sands of Dundrum Bay for the better part of a year, battered by successive storms that might have broken a lesser hull entirely, had held. It had held long enough to be repaired, long enough to be reconsidered, long enough to be given a second purpose entirely distinct from the one Brunel had first imagined for her. In that quiet persistence, in the sheer stubborn integrity of the iron itself, even as the company around her collapsed, there was perhaps the truest vindication yet of everything Brunel had argued for in choosing that material in the first place. That vindication, however, belonged to a ship that would never again sail under the flag of the company that built her. The Great Western Steamship Company, having poured so much of its remaining capital into the Dundrum salvage, could not long survive the expense. Within a few years of her limping return to a proper dock, the company that had commissioned her, argued over her, and nearly ruined itself twice in her name was dissolved, its assets sold to satisfy creditors who had waited too long for a return that never came. The ship passed into other hands, as great ships so often do, carried forward not by the loyalty of those who first dreamed her into being, but by the calculations of men who saw in her hull a use that Brunel himself might scarcely have recognized. The buyers were Liverpool men, and their trade was emigration. It was the 1850s now, and the world had shifted around the ship as surely as the sands of Dundrum Bay had shifted beneath her keel. Gold had been found in Australia, and with the gold had come a hunger that gripped half of Britain, a hunger to cross an ocean that had once seemed impossibly distant, in search of a fortune that seemed, for a brief, giddy decade, within reach of anyone willing to make the voyage. The ship that had been built to carry the wealthy in comfort across the Atlantic was refitted, her once elegant saloons reconsidered, additional berths built into spaces that had never been meant to hold so many souls, and she was sent instead to the far side of the world, carrying not the merchants and gentry Brunel had imagined, but ordinary families, willing to endure months at sea for the promise of a new life on a new continent. It was, in its way, a stranger and a longer career than the one first intended for her. She would make this run between England and Australia dozens of times over the better part of 3 decades. Her holds and cabins filled each voyage with passengers whose names rarely survive in any record, whose hopes and disappointments are lost to us now, except in the aggregate. The tens of thousands who crossed in her, one voyage after another, until the ship herself became, without any particular ceremony or announcement, one of the great engines of a migration that would reshape an entire continent. She was not remembered for this the way she had once been remembered for her iron hull or her screw propeller. The work was steady, unglamorous, essential. Ships that do steady work rarely gather headlines. Her engines, replaced once after the Dundrum grounding, were replaced again as steam technology advanced beyond what even Brunel had imagined possible. And for some years she ran as a proper steamer on this new and lucrative route, her funnel still marking her against the horizon as something more than an ordinary sailing vessel. But steam technology in those decades moved with a speed that made yesterday's marvel into tomorrow's burden, and by the 1870s, the calculations that had once favored engines began, for a ship of her particular design and age, to run the other way. Coal was expensive. Her machinery, however many times renewed, was no longer competitive against the newer, more efficient steamers being built on the Clyde and the Mersey. The men who owned her by this point made the decision that so many owners of aging steamships made in that era, they removed her engines entirely, stripped her of the machinery Brunel had fought so hard to install, and converted her into what she had never been designed to be: a full sailing ship, entirely dependent on the wind that Brunel had always intended to keep merely as a supplement. There is something quietly poignant in this conversion, though the men who carried it out were thinking only of costs and cargo capacities, not of legacies. The ship that had been the first iron vessel to cross an ocean under her own steam power, the ship whose propeller had been argued over and tested and championed as the future of the sea, was now rigged out with additional masts, her funnel removed, her engine room emptied and given over to cargo, and sent to sea as though the intervening decades of engineering progress had simply been folded backward. She still carried the iron hull that Brunel had insisted upon. She still carried, somewhere in her structure, the evidence of the ambitions that had built her. But her purpose now was the humble one shared by so many aging vessels of the age, to carry bulk cargo wherever cargo needed carrying, for whatever owner could still find a use for her. Her fame, such as it had been, faded steadily through these years. She was no longer written about in the newspapers that had once followed her launch and her grounding with such anxious attention. She became, instead, one ship among many, a name on shipping registers, a hull that made its slow way between continents carrying coal or wheat or whatever else filled her holds, known to the men who worked her but largely forgotten by the public that had once marveled at her iron sides. This is the ordinary fate of extraordinary vessels once their extraordinary moment has passed, and there was nothing unusual in it, except perhaps that so few ships had ever been quite so extraordinary to begin with. Her final working voyage came in the early 1880s, by which point she was carrying coal bound around Cape Horn, that treacherous southern passage that had broken so many ships before her and would break so many more after. The Horn, as sailors of every era knew, did not forgive age or fatigue in a vessel, and the ship that met it was by now more than 3 decades old. Her iron hull sound, perhaps, but her rigging and structure worn by years of hard service in a role her builder had never intended for her. The passage damaged her severely. Accounts speak of a leak that would not be stopped, of cargo shifting, of a crew struggling against weather that tested every seam in a hull built for a different age of engineering entirely. She was forced to turn aside, to seek shelter rather than press on toward the destination her cargo had been meant for, and the nearest shelter of any use lay far to the south, in the scattered and windswept harbors of the Falkland Islands. It was there, in Port Stanley, that her working life as a sailing ship effectively ended. The damage she had suffered rounding the Horn was judged too extensive, too costly to repair for a vessel whose earning potential had already been diminishing for years. Rather than pay for repairs on a hull that might not justify the expense, her owners chose the path so many owners of aging ships chose in that era. She was sold where she sat, her role reduced from an active vessel to something more static and less demanding. For some years she served as a storage hulk, moored in the harbour, her holds now used not for cargo in transit but for wool awaiting shipment on other vessels, her masts and rigging gradually stripped away as they became unnecessary to a ship that no longer needed to sail anywhere at all. She had gone, in the space of a single ill-fated voyage, from an active trading ship to something closer to a floating warehouse, useful still, but useful in a diminished and static way that would have seemed almost unimaginable to the crowds who had once watched her glide down the floating harbour in Bristol. Even this reduced usefulness did not last forever. As the decades passed and her hulk service too became more trouble than it was worth, she was eventually towed to a quieter corner of the harbour and simply left there, no longer even actively employed, abandoned to the slow processes of rust and weather that work on iron left too long in salt water and southern wind. There is something almost unbearably quiet about this final resting place for a ship that had once been announced at her launch as the largest vessel afloat in the world. No crowds, no ceremony, no acknowledgement that anything of significance was ending. She simply sat, low in the water, her iron sides slowly giving way to rust, in a harbour at the edge of the known world, while the century that had built her gave way to a new one that had already forgotten why she had ever mattered. It is worth pausing on this quiet, unglamorous ending because it is so far removed from everything her launch had promised. The ship that Brunel had built to prove the future of iron and steam, that Bristol had celebrated as its own particular triumph, that had crossed the Atlantic to public astonishment and had grounded in Dundrum Bay to public sympathy, ended her working days not in some dramatic wreck or celebrated final voyage, but in the slow, undramatic accumulation of rust in a remote southern harbour, valued now for nothing more than the space she occupied and the shelter her hulk still offered to whatever cargo needed keeping dry. This too is a kind of history, the kind that rarely makes for stirring stories at the time it happens, though it would, in the fullness of years still to come, make for one of the more remarkable second acts any ship of her age would ever receive. For nearly 40 years she rested there in Sparrow Cove, a scuttled hulk beneath the pale Falkland sky, her iron sides holed and her holds left open to the tide. The men who had settled her into the shallows in 1937 had done so with the same practical indifference that had governed her final working decades, seeing in her only a hull too old to insure and too troublesome to tow further, a useful container for wool rather than a vessel with any claim on memory. The sea did what the sea does to iron given time and salt water enough. Her plates wept rust into the cove, barnacles and limpets colonized her waterline. Sheep occasionally grazed near her stern where the land came close, and children from Port Stanley are said to have played within her ribcage of frames, climbing where sailors had once stood watch, unaware that they moved through the remains of the first ocean-going ship, built entirely of iron and driven by a screw. She had become, in the plainest sense, a wreck among wrecks, one relic in a harbour that held several, distinguished from her neighbours chiefly by her size, and by a hull form that any trained eye might have recognized as unusually old, unusually large, and unusually far ahead of its time, had any trained eye thought to look. For a long while, none did. The world had other ships and other wars to think about, and the particular achievement of a single vessel launched in 1843 receded behind decades of larger and louder history. But history has a way of circling back to what it has set aside, and by the middle of the 20th century, a small number of naval historians and marine engineers had begun to take a renewed interest in the origins of iron shipbuilding, tracing the lineage of the modern steel hull back through its earliest experiments, back through the great transitional decades of the 1840s and 50s, back, inevitably, to Bristol and to Brunel. In doing so, they came to understand what remained in Sparrow Cove not as scrap, but as evidence, a physical record of engineering decisions made more than a century before, still legible in riveted plate and watertight bulkhead despite the rust and the years. The realization arrived slowly, and then all at once, the way such realizations often do. This hull, sitting half-submerged and forgotten at the bottom of the world, was the oldest surviving iron steamship anywhere, the direct ancestor of every ocean liner and every ironclad and every modern hull that had followed her, and she was disintegrating where she lay. The recognition of what she represented came with an unavoidable second recognition, which was that recognition alone would not save her. Iron given up to salt water does not preserve itself out of respect for its own history, and by the 1960s, naval architects who examined what remained of her hull warned that she had perhaps a decade, perhaps less, before the corrosion that had been working on her since 1937 finished what the scuttling had begun. A ship that had survived storm, grounding, decades of ocean crossing, and a slow retirement as a floating warehouse now faced the quieter but more final threat of simply rusting into the cove floor and vanishing plate by plate into a shape no longer recognizable as a ship at all. It was this urgency, more than sentiment, that drove the effort that followed, though sentiment played its part as well, for those who had come to understand her significance had also come to feel, in the particular way historians feel about objects they have rescued from obscurity, a kind of proprietary tenderness toward her survival. The operation that followed, mounted in 1970, remains among the more extraordinary feats of maritime salvage undertaken in the 20th century, not for its scale in tonnage moved, but for the sheer improbability of what it proposed. To raise a hull that had lain scuttled and rusting for decades, to make her buoyant enough to be towed, and to bring her home across nearly 8,000 miles of open ocean to the dock in Bristol, where she had first been laid down more than 125 years before. Engineers and salvage crews worked through the harsh Falklands weather to patch her hull sufficiently to refloat her, sealing what breaches they could and pumping her holds clear of water that had sat undisturbed for a generation. She was floated onto a submersible pontoon barge, her weakened frames unable to withstand a conventional tow across such a distance, and in this manner, cradled rather than sailed, she began her improbable second Atlantic crossing, the tow line stretching ahead of her toward a home port she had not seen since the 1840s. The journey took weeks, and along its length the salvage crews watched the weather with the particular anxiety of men responsible for cargo that could not be replaced. She had crossed this ocean in her working youth in a matter of days under her own steam and sail. Now she crept across it at the pace her ruined hull demanded, patient and passive, carried rather than carrying. But she held. The pontoon bore her weight. The patched plates kept the sea at bay, and in the summer of 1970, the hull of the ship that had once been the largest vessel afloat came at last into the mouth of the Avon, moving up the same tidal river she had descended on her first voyage down to open water more than a century before. What awaited her at Bristol was not the modest curiosity of dock workers, but a welcome on a scale the city had not offered a ship in generations. Crowds gathered along the banks of the Avon and thronged the quaysides as she was towed upriver, drawn by a story that had by then travelled through newspapers and television broadcasts across the country. The great iron ship, lost for decades at the bottom of the world, was coming home to the very dock where her keel had first been laid. Church bells are said to have rung along parts of the route. Small boats crowded the river to escort her, and when she at last approached the entrance to the dry dock, built especially for her construction more than a century earlier, the dock into which no ship her size had been expected to fit, and from which she had emerged in 1843 to general astonishment, the crowd that had gathered to see her return numbered in the tens of thousands. She passed back through the lock gates she had once strained to clear, guided this time not by her own engines, but by tugs and patient hands, and settled at last into the dock that had shaped her more than a century after she had left it as the most advanced vessel afloat. The work of preserving her did not end with her return, and in truth, it had only just begun. The iron that had carried her across so many oceans and lain so long beneath salt water required careful, sustained attention if it was to survive the decades still ahead, for corrosion, once it has taken hold of a hull, does not stop simply because the ship has come to rest in fresh air. Engineers devised a system to control the humidity around her lower hull, keeping the air dry enough to slow the rust that had so nearly consumed her, while conservators worked plate by plate to stabilize what remained and to understand, through careful study of her surviving iron, exactly how she had been built and exactly how close she had come to being lost entirely. It is slow work, unglamorous and unending, the kind of labor that produces no dramatic unveiling but simply continues year upon year, so that a hull once given up to the bottom of a cove in the South Atlantic might remain legible to those who come to see her, a physical argument still standing in dry dock for the idea that iron and steam and a single engineer's stubborn calculations could carry a ship farther than anyone before her had thought possible. It is worth pausing now at the end of her long story to ask what it was she actually began. Before the Great Britain there were wooden ships, and after her there were iron ones, and that simple fact, stated so plainly, does not begin to describe the distance she crossed. She was not the first vessel to use iron in her construction, nor the first to carry a screw propeller, nor even the first to attempt an ocean crossing under steam. But she was the first to gather all of these things into a single hull and prove, through the plain fact of her survival across decades and oceans, that they could be trusted together. Every steel-hulled liner that followed her, every great screw-driven ship that carried passengers and cargo across the Atlantic and beyond, owed something of its basic architecture to the choices made in that dock at Bristol. The modern ocean liner, in the shape it would take for the century that followed, was not invented in a single moment of inspiration. It was assembled piece by piece from decisions that Brunel and his shipwrights made under considerable uncertainty, and the Great Britain stands as the place where those decisions were first tested together, in iron, at sea, where failure would have been immediate and total. That she did not fail in that fundamental way, that she instead endured groundings and storms and 40 years of hard commercial service and still remained recognizably herself, gave the whole enterprise of iron shipbuilding a kind of permission it had not quite possessed before her. It is difficult at this distance to separate the ship from the man who built her, and perhaps it is not necessary to try. Brunel's career was full of ventures that strained against the accepted limits of what engineering could accomplish, and not all of them succeeded on his terms. His atmospheric railway in Devon operated only briefly before its costs proved unsustainable. His birth was attended by difficulty, and his death came early, worn down by the accumulated weight of ambitions he had refused to abandon even as his health failed him. He was, by the accounts that survive, a man who found it nearly impossible to accept a smaller version of an idea once the larger version had occurred to him. This was true of his bridges, his tunnels, his railways built to a wider gauge than any other in the country, and it was true, above all, of his ships. The Great Western had been the largest steamship of her age. The Great Britain surpassed her by a considerable margin. The Great Eastern, which he would design in the years that followed, dwarfed them both, a vessel so large that no one quite knew what to do with her, built for a scale of trade that had not yet arrived to justify her existence. There is a pattern in this, and it is not a flattering one if read only as a record of practical success. Brunel's ships were often ahead of the world they were built to serve. The Great Britain herself was not, in her first years, a commercial triumph. She lost money for her owners, ran aground, and forced the Great Western Steamship Company into the position of selling her at a loss to men who would use her for entirely different purposes than the ones for which she had been designed. Judged strictly by the ledgers of the 1840s, she was a costly miscalculation. And yet, it is exactly this kind of miscalculation, repeated across a career, that has secured Brunel's name in the history of engineering rather than simply the history of business. He built for a future he could sense arriving, but could not always time correctly, and he accepted the financial and personal cost of that misalignment with what the record suggests was a kind of stubborn equanimity, or perhaps simply an inability to see any other way of working. The risks he took with the Great Britain were not reckless in the sense of being careless. They were calculated, argued over, tested where testing was possible, and defended with the kind of technical reasoning that could satisfy a board of skeptical directors, at least for a time. But they were risks nonetheless, taken in an area where the available evidence was thin and the potential losses, had the iron hull failed as many predicted, would have been total and possibly fatal to everyone aboard. That the ship did not fail in that manner is a testament to the soundness of Brunel's calculations, but it is also, honestly, a matter of some fortune. Engineering at this frontier always carries an element of the untested, and Brunel's willingness to carry that element forward, ship after ship, project after project, is the quality for which he is remembered as much as for any single success. There is in this a larger pattern that extends well beyond one engineer or one ship. The history of shipbuilding, looked at across centuries, is a long and largely unbroken record of builders pressing against whatever limits their era's materials and knowledge placed before them, and of those limits eventually giving way, sometimes gradually and sometimes all at once. Wood gave way to iron because iron could be shaped and strengthened in ways timber could not, and iron would in time give way to steel for much the same reasons. Sail gave way to steam because steam did not depend on the wind's cooperation, and paddle wheels gave way to screws because screws answered to rougher seas with a reliability paddles could not match. Each of these transitions was resisted at the time by people with sound and reasonable objections, and each was eventually accepted, not because the objections were foolish, but because someone built the thing that proved them incomplete. The Great Britain belongs to this pattern as one of its clearer instances, a ship built at the exact hinge point between two ages of maritime technology, carrying forward the evidence that would make the next age possible. She is not unique in this position, but she is unusually well preserved as a record of it, which is perhaps her final and most quietly important distinction. Today she rests in the same dry dock at Bristol where she was built, in Great Western Dock, along the water she left in 1843 and to which she was returned after her long absence in 1970. The dock has been fitted with a glass structure at deck level, sealed and filled with dehumidified air, creating an environment in which the rate of corrosion that had been slowly consuming her iron for decades has been reduced to something close to a standstill. Visitors walking above this glass surface see, beneath their feet, the shape of the ship's lower hull sitting in what appears to be water, but is in fact a careful illusion, a shallow layer that reflects light in a way that suggests the sea without actually touching the iron below. It is an unusual solution to an unusual problem, born of the recognition that a ship built to survive saltwater could not, in the long run, survive being kept in it. And so, the same element that carried her across two hemispheres and very nearly ended her in a South Atlantic cove has been, in her final resting place, carefully excluded from the metal itself, replaced by dry, controlled air and the patient attention of conservators who check season after season that the corrosion has not resumed. She stands there now as both ship and monument, restored on her upper decks to something resembling her working appearance, her lower hull left honest about its age and its history, patched and marked in ways that tell their own story to those who know how to read them. Visitors can walk her decks, descend into the spaces where her engines once turned, and stand beneath the glass to look up at the shape of her from below, an angle no one on the ocean ever had reason to see. She receives them quietly, the way any old ship receives the attention of a later age, without complaint and without much need for interpretation, beyond what she already offers simply by continuing to exist. She does not require a listener to imagine her. She is there, iron and timber and glass, sitting in the dock her builders raised her from, holding still the questions her long service asked of the sea and of the age that made her. There is little more to add. She was built when iron and steam were still questions rather than answers, and she carried those questions across an ocean, then a second one, then many more, until the questions became, through her example and the examples of the ships that followed her, simply the way things were done. She sank low in storms, ran aground on a headland, sailed as cargo, sailed as accommodation, and was finally brought home to the dock that built her to rest under glass and controlled air, her hull quiet now, holding whatever the iron still remembers of the ocean it once crossed. If you have enjoyed this quiet history, you are welcome to find more great ships waiting on this channel, resting as she does for whoever wishes to sit with them a while longer.